Hi, everybody. Welcome to the next Palbox Secure session, which is going to be on how to transition your legacy system to the cloud for better security. I'm Chloe Bowen, product specialist here at Palbox, and I'm here with Dave Ledoux. I'd like to thank our sponsors, HITRUST, Goodman Law, Beyond LLC, and HIPAA Ready. Feel free to submit questions for Q&A anytime during the presentation, and we'll get to them at the end. You see the option to ask a question or also engage in the chat when you're not in the full screen mode, just so you know. Any questions that we don't answer, we'll follow up with a written response. So we will get to all of your answers if we don't do it during this talk. So a little about Dave. Dave Ledoux is the CIO at Nizhoni Health, the largest home healthcare provider in Massachusetts, and a Palbox customer since 2018. Dave makes sure Nizhoni's clinical and operations team leverage the most innovative methods and industry-leading tools to create high-performing processes and teams. Since joining Nizhoni in 2018, originally as VP of Technology Services, he's been instrumental managing this company's shift to the cloud for scalable growth. With over 2 decades of implementing new technologies and providing end-user support, Dave has held roles at Okta, Athena Health, and several education and technology organizations. So today, Dave and I are going to have a conversation about how he's been able to transition Nizhoni completely to the cloud during just his short 2 years at the company. And hopefully this will inspire you to consider doing the same. So let me just share this presentation real quick. All right, let me go to present mode. Okay, here we go. All right, so Dave, let's just start at the top. What was it like transitioning from a tech company to a legacy environment?
Thanks, Chloe. In many ways, it was a rude awakening. Coming from the Valley in San Francisco, where I don't know if anything is on premise anymore, back to home healthcare, which does lag many verticals, but healthcare as a whole really relies on paper. I recently had, in the last few months, I had an ER visit, and I left with a packet after 6 or 7 hours of being in ER that was as thick as any financial prospectus that I've ever seen. And the kicker was 2 weeks later, in the mail, a follow-up survey came on paper with like fill in the bubble with a number 2 pencil that was intended to be mailed back. So healthcare just really exists on paper for some reason. For our company specifically, even in 2018, latter part of 2017, I should say, we had people still, nurses, clinicians, starting their day by picking up a stack of paper, which was their route for the day for home care, and the notes that they would fill in. They would go throughout their day, bring them back into the mail thing on the wall, and return their completed notes. Like, imagine other businesses 2 or 3 years ago. Imagine, like, has Uber ever had paper, right? Did Google think of paper 3 years ago? No. And so we had no tracking, no visibility, no reporting, no analytics. We had no insight into anything. And so my opportunity was really to put all of the current tools in place in very short order and lift Nizhoni into the cloud. It was a really kind of a blank slate opportunity, which has come out, I think, really fantastically. And I hope it inspires others to take the leap themselves.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing sometimes is just taking that initial leap because it seems really daunting, which is one of the things we're going to talk about today, I think. So, but before we talk about how you do it, let's try to convince people that they should do it. So how does moving to the cloud help your security posture?
Well, for me, I kind of have an example that I think is easy to describe the before and after. And that example would be imagining using traditional tumbler keys that you would put on a key ring to manage door access in a large company, right? Who has a copy of that? You have no audit trail. Maybe you have a paper sheet stuck on a clipboard in a room somewhere on a string, maybe. How do you control if someone who has exited the company still has a copy or not? Maybe they gave it to someone, maybe they didn't. how do you change a lock if you do have a key that you know escaped? You have to physically go to all these locks. And so now expand that to be a global company, right? That's just, it's untenable and really unimaginable. So cloud fixes those types of problems, those varied, disparate, widespread issues across a distributed office model or a distributed workforce model by giving you a central lens and a control center. So to continue with the lock analogy, you could have one administrative person in charge of security, for instance, in Chicago, who wants to unlock a door in Japan. And it's now as easy as pressing a button in software. You know exactly who pressed that lock, when they pressed it, what lock was unlocked where, and who entered. And cloud is what enabled that because it carried ID across and it used the power of the internet and a connected hardware model to make sure that happens. That ties into Active Directory, which should be your source of truth for many people and their company. And so apply that across your HRIS or your ITSM or any other platform you have, your BI platform, and you no longer imagine work as going to a physical place. You now have a very dynamic environment that can be centrally managed from anywhere that you choose. And I think that's the beauty and the luxury of the cloud after the initial heavy lift.
Yeah, those are all good points. So now that we've convinced people that they should transition to the cloud, how should they get started if they want to go from an on-prem system or a hybrid system to the cloud? What's the first thing to do?
That is that key moment, right? So, I mean, I think I have to make it very clear that this is not necessarily for every vertical as easy as just saying, you know what, gosh darn it, I'm going to do this. This guy that I've never met on the internet says I should do it, and here I go. The more on-prem applications you have, the heavier the initial lift is going to be. There's really no way to get around that fact. There are myriad tools which help bridge that gap between on-premise and cloud connectivity. But if you have in-house developed software, if you are a hospital system, right, that has maybe your EMR that you have built throughout the years that likely exists in a data center, then you're going to have some higher hurdles initially, but there are ways to bridge that gap with AWS, Azure, Google Cloud things, so you can bridge between on-prem and cloud. So that aside, I really think choosing your identity provider is pivotal. Now, I come from Okta, and that did tilt my hand. Let me make it very clear. I was given no price advantage as a customer. You know, I may know their product better than some as a former employee, but they didn't give it to me just because they came back and knocked on the door on the sales call. But they exist in a very diverse space, meaning there are peers and strong competitors in that same identity provider space in the same upper right quadrant. And ideally, when choosing your identity provider, you want to have a robust application store so that you have as many pre-built applications as possible. Like imagine why many of us choose iOS or Android, right? We look in the store and there's things on both sides, both platforms that make sense to us. And that's pivotal when choosing where you house your identity. I think ideally, as you go through your cloud journey, you want to make sure that you enforce multi-factor authentication universally. That really leverages your identity to the maximum. That way that no password can be spoofed. You don't necessarily need to start having 18 and 26 and 38 character passwords anymore, because you need that second factor, which would be biometric data with your fingerprint, or a phone call, or a text message, or some other form of security key that physically attaches to a device. I guess the problem with cloud is that where is it, right? So on-prem kind of has, I'll say, the luxury, even though it's actually less convenient, but the luxury of saying, okay, you know, I have a device that's in that room over there. I see that there's a chain on the door, therefore I know it's secure. Whereas cloud, especially public cloud, exists in someone else's infrastructure. So putting the gateway at the identity is very important. Ensure as you take these initial steps and pursue vendors for your cloud apps, make sure they follow the protocols that your identity provider has put in place. Meaning that if you have single sign-on with MFA, your subsequent apps that you pursue exist in that same cloud ecosystem. That way you're always taking steps forward. You're never going around the security gate that you've put up in place. Socializing your new changes across your org will help as people look to adopt things, but ultimately ensuring everyone understands the security nature and the risk around cloud will make sure that your organization can have a kind of a safe step into that new space.
Yeah, for anybody who's been attending presentations yesterday and today, passwords and two-factor or multi-factor authentication keeps coming up. So there's probably a reason for that. And
there is.
Yeah. All right. So what are some of the biggest benefits that transitioning to the cloud has afforded your company?
That list is long. I won't spend all of our time talking about it, but I think high level, the flexibility to have a dynamic work environment. That means that your office is now wherever you are. And while working remotely, I think has always been a thing, not always been a thing, in recent years has been something that's been expanding. The notion of expanding that to be truly functional from wherever you are with no limitations is kind of the theory behind dynamic work. We can all sit at home and send email and send Word documents and collaborate on things, but in the past, there's been a number of items and workflows that people would say, well, I'll finish that when I get to the office. And having everything in the cloud makes it so that the notion of a physical office is no longer necessary. There's a lot of benefit to it, and I'm not saying that face-to-face interactions have expired, but especially in light of what's happened this year, not having to go to an office for any viable work reason really is I think the biggest power of having everything in the cloud. So for our workforce, we kind of have many hundreds of field clinicians, which function as contractors, even though they are full-time employees, they really never go to an office. It's a very rare thing for them. So moving all of their applications onto a tablet device or a laptop at their choosing, which has data connectivity, allows them to work from anywhere and not go to an office if they never want to. Very different than just a few years ago when going to an office was at least a twice daily task. And the nice part about having cloud, since you have things that are so interconnected via API and other technologies, is you can start to trigger some automatic workflows. And so if you have, let's say you're onboarding a new employee, you can, with the right application choices, tie in your HRIS to your ITSM and have the onboarding via HR trigger the IT workflow so that when that user shows up, they've got the right applications assigned automatically. They've got hardware assets that are triggered, and that's set up on a timeline with reminders that can spit out of the same system. I think most important for me, the benefit of transitioning to the cloud is moving towards zero trust, which ties back into MFA that you've brought up. It's the kind of castle and moat model of old, meaning that in the office is secure, and the notion of being in that space or out of that space, having different security postures and profiles, that is really kind of moving into the rear view mirror. I think this year has pushed a lot of companies in that direction, but the security has to be the user. Who are you coming in? Where are you going within our ecosystem? And what should you be allowed to do? And so, and that's where having a solid identity provider and cloud connected applications starts to really make sense. For me, quite literally going to the office and let's say breaking in, so to speak, from a security perspective would only get you internet. There's nothing that you could access there. And so that while that network is secure, certainly, all of the gateway is put on the user and the credentialing side.
Yeah, and all this transition to the cloud, you couldn't have timed it better, really. With the
I got lucky. I did get lucky.
Yeah, you were in a good position, or in as best of a position as you could be coming into this year. So, but speaking of, it's really all about people at the end of the day, So what was your colleagues' reaction to all these rapid changes? Like, any security measure is only as good as people using it correctly, right?
I agree totally. And from an IT perspective, my angle is always the customer service side. I think there's maybe a very old posture by now, that IT is kind of a rules-based system that, I mean, there's been some very entertaining comedy shows around this, but the notion that when someone says this isn't working, the response is, well, you're not using it right. And so I think the current posture for IT has to be and should be a frictionless experience. Like, the security is my burden to bear, and it shouldn't be at the end user side. It shouldn't be, oh, let me just have you put in your 17th password and authenticate with your 7th phone, and turn around and blink at the camera. It should be as frictionless as possible, and that's always kind of what guides my security principles. I think overall, when you're proposing all this stuff, people get very excited, certainly at the executive level, right? You kind of dabble with some cost savings and how flexible it'll be, and we can start to drop some real estate and all that, and people get very excited. During the actual implementation and the transition, that's when kind of the rubber hits the road, and not everyone is excited during that, because change is something that can be disruptive, especially in a busy environment. To go from process A to process B requires, some gap in the middle of either both or lacking one for a brief period. With a lot of communication and with the right tools, some tools are just not as good as others. There's no way to deny that. Having the flexibility on the other side is, for me, has always been worth the effort. Testing behind the scenes. IT kind of works in the shadows, behind the curtains at night. I think the best IT is IT that you kind of don't really notice. And doing all that on the tech team side makes it so that the end users can possibly feel as close to a frictionless experience as possible. Picking slow weeks during holidays when maybe much of the company goes on vacation, there's downtime. Don't pick the time when your company needs to do financial reporting, to change over your monetary systems, etc. But if you can control those interruptions to your colleagues, then there's a very good chance they're going to like what you're doing. Especially when in the old days they used to have to go somewhere to do a specific thing, and now they can do it in their pajamas at their house during a snowstorm. That's great. For me, the biggest test was when we changed our phone system, and about 3 weeks to a voice over IP cloud-based phone system. And about 3 weeks later, I'm in New England, in Boston, there was a snowstorm, and that was the first time in the history of this company, founded in 2000, that our company can answer their phones from home. In the past, they would have to literally just plan on shoveling and driving different amounts of time, hours sometimes, to get to an office to answer phones to keep the business running. So that was kind of when the first light bulb went off that, oh, this could be pretty good.
So what did people say? Did they tell you that they were grateful, or did they complain, or how did it go?
No, they did. So that's a good question. So on the day that it happened, since it was the first, it was a little rough. My team kind of got swamped with phone calls because, of course, people hadn't used their soft phone yet remotely, and so they hadn't tested it really. They hadn't understand. A few people had, but it was kind of a lack of understanding, and whether that day forced the habit or shone a bright light on what could be a habit, I think it's kind of up for debate. But by 11 a.m. that morning, the company had settled in to the idea that they don't have to drive anywhere. And I mean, literally, before this, we would, if there was a snowstorm scheduled, we would put staff in a hotel that was right next to our office to ensure they wouldn't have to drive the next day. And then they would walk across a very cold parking lot in a blizzard and sit in an office space during a blizzard and answer phones, because that's just what an old digital phone system could offer. It just didn't have any flexibility. And so that phone moment was what triggered other things like, oh, so I can do this. So I can print from my house and send it to, Karen in accounting. And then pretty soon the office started to be kind of a quiet place. No one came in anymore.
Oh, that's great. except I miss coming into the office.
Yeah, I'm a people person myself, and it is nice to be around folks. But at the very least, it's at your choice now, right? It's not, you don't have to sit in traffic at 8:15 in the morning to be there by 9. You can you get flexibility around when you go there.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point too, which is kind of what this presentation is all about, which is the inertia. People across the board hate change. It doesn't even have to do with this one particular change, but just in general, people hate change. And sometimes you need forcing function like a blizzard, or I don't know, for example, a pandemic, to get people to actually change their habits or their systems. And then they might realize that their new system is actually better,
I hope many have. I would hate to think that for at least the majority, the last number of months, aside from the medical situation itself, that being displaced into a different work environment, to your point, I would hate to think that it's been bad for people. I would like to think that they've found the good side. Now, I get that and certainly as you get more and more urban areas, maybe the square footage is lacking, and there's all sorts of small peculiarities that change what people think about, my home office or whatever they consider. But I do hope the flexibility that we've built in, that we've had to, continues when we don't have to, and we kind of leverage that in the best possible way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a really good point. So how much time, money, etc., whatever else you can measure, has transitioning to the cloud afforded your company?
Monetarily, it has been a little bit of a windfall for us. I didn't come in with quite the sense of scale that I would be able to manage financially for this particular migration. And most of that was because we had so many disparate systems that I don't think, as a new employee, I could fully wrap my head around our spend. Ultimately, in the end, my net annual IT spend dropped by about 50% in moving to the cloud. And most of that was finding and removing redundancies, both in platforms and application, and centralizing management so I get oversight of my technology stack. I was able to pull out of my data center footprint, which had a pretty reasonable cost month over month. And since I'm now leveraging, transactional costs in the cloud, and so that was a nice savings. But I think the easiest example really is going back to the phones. I can't stress enough how many faxes we used. So we're a multi-office company, and we would fax between offices. Our headquarters was large enough that people would fax from one side of the office to the other side of the office, kind of like a paper version of email, I guess, really. And when I first got there, it was the amount of paper coming out of these faxes looked like someone had maybe accidentally sent 100 print jobs. And so you go to cancel and clear the jobs, and you realize it is in fact one valid print job, and like a ream of paper, and that was a job, and that would get clipped and put in a binder. And these were real things that we make money from, and it was just kind of fascinating, considering my primarily tech background. And so for savings, for cloud-based voice over IP, my annual fax line cost alone, and I had hundreds of fax lines spread throughout various carriers. It was quite the net, but that one line item exceeded my entire voice over IP cost currently. And so on top, so if you go back then, so pre-savings, I had that fax cost. I then had my normal phone line costs with myriad 800 numbers that fed into it. I had disparate digital phone systems in a hub and spoke model with a redundant data center, a back end. And so that cost ultimately was about 6x what I pay for VoIP now for my whole phone system. And in VoIP, fax is just an included item, like it's just part of the package. You don't even pay for it, unlimited. Whereas prior, with copper-based faxing, you're paying page by page. You're buying each number per month. So if you carry that kind of 6x cost across a number of systems, getting rid of physical server licensing, physical server hardware, the data center footprint, the cost savings was really significant. Now, for anyone out there in the IT world who's listening, I know that migrating if phone system, even if it's just VoIP to VoIP, let alone old copper digital to VoIP, is a pretty big headache. And so I know that is an extremely heavy lift. That one wasn't taken lightly. We did do that in the last couple of days of December to try to find the lowest possible dip in call volume. And we pulled it off. It worked, which was a big sleepless night with a very restful next day when things worked fine. But the cost savings are very real. The one thing I need to stress is that most cloud technology is billed transactionally. So for instance, you could set up your AWS account and maybe you get 10 gigabytes of elastic storage, for instance. You may start storing recorded phone calls from your inbound reception desk and not pay attention to it, and your elastic storage will just expand to accommodate what you've got. Well, you may just automatically expand to 50 gigabytes or 100 gigabytes and not realize you're doing that until you get the next bill at the end of the month. And so you planned on maybe $27 per gigabyte, and then you get, 50x of that because you didn't pay attention. And so some people initially can get caught out with the transactional costs, and that's an area to kind of keep your eye out.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the fax machine, the evils of the fax machine. That's one of the Powbox mantras, I would say.
Yeah, well, I mean, so as you know, ironically enough, the reality is that faxing still does take place. It has just become an electronic variant of it, right? So like when EMRs talk to each other, they generally fax between. It doesn't go to paper very often anymore, but really moving things into the space that Powbox exists in is one of my big motivators. But it kind of smacks you in the face as being very ironic that it's still there. It just became an electronic version. It's still called faxing. It's crazy.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we have two mantras at Powbox: kill the fax and HIPAA compliant email seamlessly.
I'm on board.
There's a question from the audience about fax machines too. Speaking of, and we have just a couple more minutes. So how long do you think it will take healthcare to completely transition away from the fax?
Whoa, that would be a very Nostradamus magic ball moment. Completely, I mean, dare I say never. I would say there's probably another 10 years plus in faxing. I know that in the primary healthcare provider space, there are a number of startups and more mature providers who are making their own apps, making their own EMRs, and making a truly kind of a cashless, paperless experience. Like at my primary care, I can't give them money for my copay, right? It's only electronic payment version. I can't fax them. It is only through email and other electronic formats. But that is the minority. Boston, as many may know, is a significant healthcare footprint in this country, and our major health systems here continue to use a significant amount of paper, and that shift is going to be very slow. As you get away from such a concentrated healthcare center like Boston into more rural areas, I mean, the good news is they become smaller, and so they are lighter weight, meaning they could shift away from fax quicker. The bad news is any small healthcare system has to play with the big healthcare systems, the kind of the way we have it set up in the United States. And as a result, if the big ones are still using faxes, then the small ones will. I would put my name on 10 or 12 years if I had to put a number on how long. I think it's pretty far out.
E-fax would still be an improvement though, right? You think?
It would, because I mean, you can track it, you can monitor, you can log it, right? I mean, the notion of having a paper fax come out of a machine that's not monitored with something like stapled to the wall that says "Don't leave it face up," per HIPAA something. I mean, that still exists. As crazy as that is, it still exists. Whereas e-fax, right, goes somewhere where you can, with Zapier, you can put something on it that says this hasn't been looked at in 10 minutes. Please check it out, and it's not on a table in a room blowing away by a window. So I mean, e-fax is a fax, but boy, the difference over a piece of paper is remarkable.
Well, at least there's a half step that people can do in between.
Agreed.
So, all right, that about wraps up our time here. If we didn't get to any questions, we'll follow up in writing, as I mentioned. So thank you so much, Dave, for your time. I think this has been really helpful. Hopefully you inspired some people. The next session is going to start in 10 minutes. It's going to be at 12 my time on the West Coast. It's going to be about embracing zero trust, which we've been talking about in all of these sessions. Kind of has to do with the two-factor authentication, that kind of stuff. How you can do that when you aren't the world's largest internet company. It can be accessible for small companies too. So thank you very much, Dave, and everybody have a nice day.
Chloe, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.